Conservation. So by the end of this lesson, students should be able to evaluate how humans can successfully conserve ecological biodiversity and contribute to global food production, appreciate the benefits that people obtain from ecosystems. So what is conservation? So the definition then of conservation is the protection of plants, animals and natural areas from the damaging effects of human activity. So if we look after the wildlife and their habitats, we can preserve them from being wiped out or becoming extinct. So that's the idea behind conservation. Failure to conserve can result in the death of organisms in their habitats. In some cases, the entire species of that organism may become extinct as well. So as an example here in Ireland, birds called corncrakes are in danger of being wiped out in Ireland due to the loss of hay meadows in which they breed. Okay, so this is like a change in human activity that's resulting in an impact on an organism. And this is what they look like here. So these guys are becoming extinct because of human activity in relation to the loss of their habitats, so meadows in which they breed. So some orchids are also threatened with extinction because their habitats are being destroyed. So we have this idea of what's called biodiversity. So basically biodiversity means the variety of living things. So if we think about the world is a contraction, the word is a contraction of the words biological diversity. So any decrease in number or types of plants and animals means there is a decrease in biodiversity. So to prevent the loss of habitats and biodiversity, it is necessary to look after our environment. So these are orchids here, and again, some orchids are under threat because they are basically losing their habitat. So if we remember, so we have, for example, we have producers. Okay, and then we have, so for example, we might have producers, then we have the primary consumers. And then we have what are called secondary consumers. Okay, so we have these food chains, if you like, let's say within a habitat. So if we take this habitat here, the producers are the organisms that produce their own food basically, and what they also offer, like they produce food then for the primary consumers and then indirectly then for the secondary consumers. So for example, this plant here might be a food source for this orchid. So we have the producer and the orchid would be a primary consumer. Now, if anything threatens, for example, the habitat in which its food source grows, and if its food source is wiped out, so if this food source gets wiped out here, that's going to have a knock-on effect, and it's going to affect all of the other organisms, let's say further up that chain as well. They're going to be wiped out also. So that's why it's really important, like if we pollute an environment, for example, and we kill off particular plants, that those plants might be like producers in that habitat, and it's not only wiping out that particular plant, but it could be wiping out a whole food chain from the producer to the primary consumers right up to the secondary consumers. So in order to keep this diversity of plants and animals that we have, it's very important that we kind of consider how our activities are impacting on the environment around us. So why do we need conservation? So why do we need to kind of think about this idea of conservation? So what are the reasons for conservation and why is it important? So to prevent organisms from becoming extinct, So at present, many organisms are facing this threat. So this threat of extinction is a real danger in relation to organisms. To maintain the balance of nature, so the loss of any one type of organism can cause dramatic results for other types of organisms. So just like what we've talked about here, if primary producers or certain plants are wiped out, it can actually wipe out a whole food chain that relies on that particular plant. Future generations have the right to the same natural resources as are found at present. So, for example, the world would be a poorer place if elephants, tigers, corncakes, orchids, or any other animals or plants become extinct. So, we want to be able to pass on and keep these organisms alive, and so that the next generation can appreciate these organisms in the future. So plants are the source of many medicines. So as plants become extinct, we lose the ability to test for new medicines. So for example, in the rainforest, there are loads of different types of plants. And like out of those plants, we can get all kinds of medicines. So we can. So if we take, for example, like we might have some kind of a plant. Okay, and then out of that plant, we might be able to extract some kind of a chemical that's in the plant that gives us the next, for example, it could be like a cure for cancer, or it could be, some a cure for many of the other types of human diseases that we have as well. So we can have, like, from plants, we can get all kinds of medicines, and those medicines then can help to alleviate human suffering. And the other thing then that's really important, if our natural resources are not protected, there is a danger that human lifestyle and even our survival will be at risk. So remember, like, not only are animals part of this food chain, but we are also tied into this food chain as well. So if we destroy like the habitats for primary producers, we are, for example, cutting off like a major food group or food source for us, which puts not only our lifestyle but puts our own survival, for example, at risk. So it's very important that scientists understand the relationship that we have with nature, and then like how important it is then for us to conserve and preserve that relationship. So what then are some of the things that we can do to support conservation? So the only species on Earth that threatens conservation is humans. So basically, like all of nature, it lives in kind of harmony with its environment, whereas we have the ability to like threaten conservation. So it is up to us, both as a species and as individuals, to support conservation measures, and humans can support conservation. So what are some of the ways that we can support conservation? So making themselves aware of the issues. So just becoming aware of nature, becoming aware of some of the issues that are out there in relation to, um, you know, habitats becoming extinct and wiped out. Joining conservation groups. So there's many different groups, particularly all around Ireland, that you can join, for example, and they will educate you on conservation and some of the things that you can do. Support groups in society that encourage proper conservation. So again, just becoming more aware and supporting these groups can have a huge impact. Refusing to join in any activity that threatens conservation, and refusing to buy products that have been sourced unethically. Okay, so all around the country there's lots of national parks, and they are sites of natural conservation as well. So they're great places to go, not only to go and spend time and look at nature, but also to become more aware of this effort in conservation. So one example is Killarney National Park. So a centre for it's also a centre for conservation and biodiversity as well, and a nice place to go and visit. So these are some of the things that we can do in order to support this effort on conservation. So what are the main causes of loss of biodiversity? So what are like some of the reasons why habitats are being wiped out and why we are seeing like whole species becoming extinct? So what are the causes of it? So some of the factors that are responsible for organisms being killed off, resulting in a loss of biodiversity, are so habitat loss or habitat fragmentation. So for example, this whole system here, exists in a habitat. So if that habitat is wiped out, this whole like food chain can be wiped out along with it. And sometimes not only can the habitat, so let's say if this is the habitat here, what can happen is we can get what's called habitat fragmentation. So for example, if we build a road through this habitat like here, what happens is it gets fragmented, for example, into two pieces. And this can have a major impact, for example, on the overall habitat as well. So this is what we mean by habitat fragmentation. So pollution, so for example, we produce waste all the time, and when that waste gets into rivers and lakes and into the environment, it causes pollution. Invasive species, so because we now can travel all over the globe, sometimes what can happen is we can bring a species from one country into another country, and it's like taking an organism that's designed to survive in one habitat into a new habitat, and that can have a major impact on the sustainability of the particular habitat, so that invasive species can take over. So invasive species basically are organisms that are introduced to an area and which cause harm. Climate change is the other one as well. So if we take climate change, for example, we have the globe, and then around the globe we have this we have an atmosphere. And what happens is, because we're burning fossil fuels, we can produce these greenhouse gases. And they, if you like, kind of add an extra layer into the atmosphere. And basically what that does then is it results in, for example, it results in heat so heat coming from the sun gets trapped inside in this layer. And what that does is it increases the temperature across the globe. And that increase in temperature can have a major impact on the climate. So we can have like erratic weather systems happening, and that can have a massive impact on the organisms, for example, in habitats. And that's as a direct result of humans, for example, burning fossil fuels to produce electricity. Over exploitation, the overuse of wildlife by people. So for example, fish, if we are overfishing our seas, or we are hunting animals to extinction, things like that, or we're using cutting down lots of trees to make furniture and make building materials for houses. This is what's called over exploitation. Human population numbers. So for example, as the human numbers increase on the earth, what that does is it increases the demand for natural resources. And again, that has an impact on biodiversity. So we end up having to build more roads and houses to facilitate people, and that cuts in and destroys natural habitats. So what we'll do is we'll look at each of these in just a little bit of detail, just to understand what they are. So habitat fragmentation, so this kind of setup here. So let's talk about that and look in a bit of detail. So habitats are being destroyed on a huge scale. So for example, we cut down forests and woodlands for timber or to clear land for housing and agriculture. So that's a way that we can lose whole habitats. Boglands are being drained for farming. So for example, boglands in Ireland and across the country, they can be drained so that the land can be used for farming. Grassland is being built on for roads, housing and factories. We can have grasslands like this where we build across them. Lakes are being destroyed by pollution, so this is a major problem. So for example, things like if we put slurry down, for example, in a field, and we put too much down, and if we put it down during a time when it's likely to rain, that runoff can get into the lake and that can cause major problems. So destruction of habitats destroys the organisms in that habitat. Sometimes the remaining habitat is too small to support any surviving organism, or the remaining habitats are too far apart to allow organisms to move between them. So the breakup of large habitats into smaller unconnected areas is called habitat fragmentation. So that's like what's happening here. So for example, we might have organisms that live in this particular part, and some might live here, And what they have to do is they might have to cross this road or go through a built-up residential area, and this can have a major impact on the health of the organism, and it can actually stop them from being able to survive in a particular habitat. So the habitat for this orangutan has been destroyed. So again, they're left in a situation where they have nowhere really to go, and as a result, their numbers can start to drop off and die off. So this is what's known as habitat fragmentation. So what's happening basically is that humans are evolving and they're progressing rapidly, and all of the other organisms that are in the environment around them struggle to keep up, for example, with the pace in which humans are changing the face of the earth. So the next big one that causes habitat loss is pollution. So pollution is caused mainly when humans add unwanted materials to the environment. So you could have something like a lake, for example. We might have a lake like so. And what can happen then is some like unwanted substance that we get rid of, like slurry, for example, can get into that lake and it can pollute it. And not only that, but we can also release stuff into the atmosphere as well. And we can kind of pollute the atmosphere here as well, like what we do, for example, with greenhouse gases. So pollutants are the materials that cause pollution. So there are three main environmental. There are three main environments that get polluted. So, for example, the air, the water, and the soil can get polluted. So, air pollution. So, the main source of air pollution are, so we have greenhouse gases, like what we talked about here. So, when we burn fossil fuels, we release things like CO2, carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and that's what's known as a greenhouse gas. We can also, as well, because of this chemicals that have been released into the environment, it can blend in, if you like, with the water that's in the sky and the clouds, and it can produce this form of acid and it can produce acid rain. CFCs, so these are gases, for example, that used to be in refrigerators. Again, they're greenhouse gases. They're similar to carbon dioxide. Dirt particles, so we just get like pieces of dirt and particles that get into the air, and you get like smog, for example, that's in the air, and you see this in built up areas. So smog, and this is kind of like, this is what it looks like. So air pollution like this, and these particles, they stay in the air and they pass around and they move around. So these can cause major problems. So everything that we're releasing into the air, for example, is a form of pollution, and it can have a massive impact on the environment. And one big one is the CFC gases and greenhouse gases, because they are contributing to global warming, and that's directly impacting on the temperature around the globe. So we can have water pollution then. So the main causes of water pollution are badly treated sewer or toilet waste. So again, think about all the waste that's being produced by humans. And if that's not treated properly, then that can be a massive source of pollution to the environment. Oil spills. So for example, we like to burn oil to heat our homes. That oil has to be mined and shipped across sea. And then what can happen sometimes is that, or they can even, like on oil rigs as well, and you can get these oil spills where this oil spills into the lakes or into the river, into seas, and it can cause major problems. It can destroy the whole habitat. So the dumping of household, farming, and industrial waste. So again, a major problem. Sometimes it can be very expensive for industries to get rid of waste. So what will happen is they will dump it illegally, and that can cause a major problem. So we can have things like this. So fish kills by lack of oxygen in the water. So sometimes what can happen is when we get, if we dump slurry into lakes, that provides a food source for certain organisms that are in the lakes, microorganisms, and their numbers can increase. And what they will do is they will absorb all of the oxygen from the lakes, and then as a result, then what will happen is the oxygen levels in the lakes will reduce, and then that will result in fishes not being able to breed in the water. and they can die from that. So fish kills by lack of oxygen. So that can be a major sign that there's a lot of pollution going on when fish are dying, for example, in lakes and rivers. So we have soil pollution then as well. So soil pollution is mainly caused by acid rain. So again, the change in like the acidity of rain, for example, can have a massive impact on the soil. Overuse of fertilizers and slurries, which is animal waste such as feces and urine in the liquid form on the land. Improper dumping of wastes, and what can happen is we can get these like algae blooms, for example, caused by excess fertilizer. So this fertilizer, when it gets into the lakes, it produces these algae, and these algae can absorb. So these are living organisms. They feed off the feces and the urine, for example, from the slurry, and then their numbers can increase in the water. And then what happens is they absorb all the oxygen out of the water, and it can kill off all of the organisms that need oxygen in the water. So how can we conserve ecological biodiversity? So what are some of the things that we can do in order to maintain this idea of biodiversity, or many living things? So to conserve organisms, we must control the factors listed earlier. So habitat loss and fragmentation, pollution, invasive species, climate change, over-exploitation, and human population numbers. So these are some of the things that need to be controlled in order to conserve ecological biodiversity. So some of the ways these factors can be controlled are considered below. So the first one is preventing habitat loss and fragmentation. So habitats can be preserved by reducing pollution, which may destroy plants and animal life. So reducing pollution, and that starts at an individual level. Planting native vegetation. So for example, plants that would naturally grow in would grow in that area. So replanting trees and other types of plants which will support native animals. Controlling or limiting buildings to preserve habitats. So again, planning permission, so not letting roads and houses be built everywhere all over the place, to control that through limiting like the number of buildings and roads and things that can be built. Preventing the entry and growth of invasive or non-native species. So again, like on border controls and things like that, there can be a massive emphasis on like preventing like bringing other invasive organisms, for example, into a country. Developing national parks and special areas of conservation where wildlife is protected by law, and also as well these places can be used to educate people as well on conservation issues. So controlling pollution then. So pollution can be controlled by proper waste management. So how do we control that? So waste management, the large number of humans and the modern style of life produce huge amounts of waste material. So these wastes include dirty water, urine, feces, plastics and packaging, along with agricultural and industrial wastes. And these wastes can be managed by using the 3 R's. So what are the 3 R's? So we have reduce. So the first R is reduce. So reduce the use of unnecessary goods and packaging. So for example, plastic bags, we can reduce. We can reuse. So for example, reuse as many materials. So for example, shopping bags, water bottles, or secondhand furniture. Use this as much as possible. So instead of buying everything new, you can buy secondhand or refurbish it or renew it. Also, as well, even just simple things like when you're going to Tesco to buy your shopping, so use the reusable bags, for example, so that you are like reusing, so that they don't have to keep being produced. And then the other one is recycle as much as possible. So recycle waste. So recycle as much waste as possible. So for example, like things like paper, glass, metals, and plastics. So in your home, just set up like a recycling. So have the bins for the different materials for recycling. Compost, like so that stuff can be easily recycled and reused, so that it's not being dumped as waste back into the environment. So this here is an example of a compost. So garden and kitchen waste in a compost. So things like, food or leftover food and things like that, it can be put into a composter like this, and then over time that the bacteria will break this down, and then that can be used as a natural fertilizer, for example, for plants in the garden. So it's a nice way to help to control pollution. So what are some of the benefits that people obtain from ecosystems? So an ecosystem is a large area containing similar types of environments and living things. So for example, if we take a woodland, like if we think about somewhere like Forest Park, a grassland, or a seashore. So if you go to somewhere like Sligo, so these are all natural ecosystems. So we obtain many benefits from ecosystems, and these benefits can be grouped into four main types. So the benefits that we get. So supporting products, controlling cultural. Okay, so if we look at each of these benefits in a bit of detail, so supporting benefits. So what are some of the supporting benefits that we get from ecological habitats or ecological systems? So supporting benefits allow other three types of benefits to exist. So ecosystems. So what are some of the like what do ecosystems support? So ecosystems, by protecting these ecosystems, we are supporting biodiversity. So for example, ecosystems contain many types of living things. So by supporting these ecosystems, we are helping to maintain biodiversity. Soil formation. Okay, so again, it provides fertile soil for us to be able to grow our crops on. Photosynthesis, which absorbs carbon dioxide and helps reduce global warming. Nutrient recycling, so dead materials rot to release valuable elements needed for new growth to occur. And water recycling, so water is absorbed by plant roots and released back into the air as water vapor. So these are, like if we take our ecosystem, these are some of the supporting benefits that our ecosystems support. Okay, so they support biodiversity, soil formation, they support this process of photosynthesis. This is really important in order for us to even be able to get all of our energy needs from food. Nutrient recycling, okay, so nutrients are recycled through the carbon cycle, and then water is recycled through the water cycle. So some of the product benefits. So ecosystems produce valuable substances or products such as, so they provide wood, for example, for all of our building needs, and so they can be used for fuels. So fuel, for example, turf or peat or firewood. So we get these products from our ecosystems. Food, including seafood and wild animals. So we get our food, we get fresh water from our ecosystems. We get medicines, so like what I was saying here, a lot of medicines are extracts from plants that come from ecosystems. Useful chemicals, so we get lots of other types of chemicals that can be used for useful products. So these are some of the product benefits that we get from having healthy ecosystems. So what are then some of the controlling benefits of ecosystems? So ecosystems help to control features such as air quality. So the plants take in carbon dioxide and give out oxygen. So again, through this process of photosynthesis, carbon dioxide is taken in from the air and it's converted into energy and oxygen. So in that way, plants, for example, help to filter and keep the air rich in oxygen. So water quality. So for example, water is purified as it goes down through the soil. So when water goes through the water cycle, it's cleaned and filtered, and it helps to, these healthy ecosystems help us to have good quality water and good quality air. So pollination, so by supporting insects. So for example, like plants have to pass their gametes from plant to plant, and they use insects to do that. And so pollination is supported when we have good healthy ecosystems. Soil erosion, so roots stabilize soil, so it stops the erosion. So flood damage, so water is absorbed or diverted. So for example, if there's floods, having good healthy ecosystems help to get rid of the excess water. So pest controls, so Pests are reduced by being eaten or weakened by parasites. So again, that's something that our ecosystems offer these in ways of pest control. So what are some of the cultural benefits then? So the social or non-material benefits of ecosystems. So what are these? So they include things like recreation. So for example, if you go to Forest Park, it's a nice place to go just to relax and walk around. Mountains and by the sea, or if you go to the sea, they're nice places to go just for recreational purposes. So it's one of the benefits of having these good ecosystems. So sports, so things like swimming, climbing and walking, again, are made more enjoyable when you have these thriving, healthy ecosystems. The use of nature in art. So, for example, they can be a place of inspiration for things like pictures, paintings, and films. And education then as well. So, trips to parks, seashores, or mountains, they can be you can go there for educational purposes. And then scientific research then as well. So again, being able to go into places and research plants and look at potential sources of medicine, it helps to advance science and our understanding of the world around us. So again, these are some of the cultural benefits of maintaining good, healthy ecosystems. Now, one thing that our ecosystems provide us with is food. So, for example, through agriculture and having these healthy ecosystems, we have like global food is produced. So, what we want to think about now is how can humans contribute to global food production? So, at present, there are slightly over 7 billion people on Earth. It is predicted that the number of humans in 2050 will be between 9 and 10 billion. So as the numbers rise, it will be necessary to increase global food production. So this need for more food is not a new problem. So as the number of people increase, the amount of food that has to be produced has to also increase in order to be able to support humans. So in the late 1950s and 1960s, the human population was increasing faster than it is now. So, however, the Green Revolution at that time resulted in huge increases in the production of food worldwide. As a result, food production matched the rise in human numbers. So, through chemistry and the invention of fertilizers, farmers were able to produce huge yields of crops, and this helped to support the growing population of people around the world. So, the Green Revolution resulted in some problems too. So, for example, the number of crops fell dramatically as the new super crops were planted widely. So the numbers of different types of crops it reduced naturally, and they were kind of taken over by these what are called super crops, which were planted widely. So the new crops needed large amounts of fertilizer and had to be sprayed with pesticide to kill off insects and pests. The new crops also used much more fresh water and needed a high level of farm technology, for example, tractors, sprayers, etc. So these are some of the problems that were associated with this green revolution in agriculture. So what happened then was that natural land that contained many species of plants and animals was converted to growing single crops, such as rice, wheat, or oil palm. These single crops are called monocultures and result in huge loss of biodiversity. So an area will be cleared and just one crop, for example, might be grown in that particular area because it's easy just to grow the one crop. But what happens is, as a result, we get whole species that are the whole habitats that are destroyed as a result. So we can see this is a common thing that you will see. So for example, in agricultural land, you'll just see one type of crop, for example, that's been grown in a particular area, and everything else is just removed from that area in order so it doesn't interfere with the crop being grown. So an oil palm plantation, so this is your oil palm plantation, and then wheat fields. So note there is only one type of plant growing as well. So in both of these, you only have the one type of plant that's growing. So there are two possible ways to produce more food. So one is to convert more land to growing crops. So that's a way that humans can contribute to global food production. Increase the yield of crops grown on present farmland, so improve farming technology so that we can get more yield for every crop that we grow. So can we increase the amount of farmland worldwide? So at present, only about 10% of the world's surface is used for growing crops. So 66% of Earth's surface is water, and some land is too dry or too hot or too cold. Or the soil is too poor to grow crops. So if we use more land for crops, it will mean we have to destroy habitats. This will result in loss of biodiversity. For this reason, this option is not the best one. So can we increase the yield of crops? So a huge amount of research is going on worldwide to increase the yield of crops. So some of this involves using older crops that were preserved as seeds in seed banks. So we have these huge seed banks, we have older crops, and sometimes those older crops might grow better, for example, in certain conditions, and we want to try and see if we can use those in order to increase the yield or the amount of food that the crop can produce. So much of the research is attempting to develop new strains of crops by adding genes to existing plant crops. It is hoped that the new crops will be able to produce increased yields, resist higher global temperatures, use less fresh water, resist pests and diseases, and have improved taste and contain more nutrients. So in addition, attempts are being made to allow plants to produce more than one crop each year. This could potentially increase food production hugely. Okay, so these are some of the things that are happening now, particularly with gene editing technology. So genes, so in the plant cells inside the nucleus, you have the chromosomes, and then the chromosomes contain genes, and the genes are made up of DNA. And these genes, if you like, so they give the plant its different characteristics. And what humans can do is, so you can think about it, it's like a kind of like a structure of DNA like this. And so within this like section of DNA or this chromosome, there'll be a certain piece of it that might, for example, give the plant its height, for example. So what scientists can actually do now is they can take out this particular gene and they can put in, let's say, replace it with a different type of gene. So they might take out a gene that doesn't allow the plant to grow, for example, in like really hot temperatures, and replace it with a gene that allows the plant to thrive in very hot conditions. So this gene editing allows us to modify and edit and make hardier strains of particular types of plants so that we can grow and make more food. So this is one area that is rapidly kind of developing, and it helps to increase food yields. So how can we reduce this food gap? So the food gap refers to the difference between the amount of food produced and the amount of food needed worldwide. So there's this, like as the number of people on the earth increases, there's a massive demand for more and more food. So this gap can be reduced in a number of ways. So we can reduce the loss or waste of food. So the food that is produced, if we can use it all without it being wasted. At present, it is estimated that up to 33% of food production for human use is not eaten, so it just goes to waste, it's just dumped. Adjust our diets, it takes far more land to produce meat, especially beef, than it does to produce the same energy content in plants. So the world's population is increasingly demanding more meat in its diet, which may not be sustainable. So other things then that we can do as well is to increase our use of poor quality land. So being able to take poor quality land and being able to use it to grow certain crops that can grow in that poor quality land. Improve how we use our existing land and water resources. So we can do things like that. Control human population. Increase our use of water-based food production, so aquaculture. So feeding fish on a fish farm, this is one type of aquaculture. So again, we can, for example, breed loads of fish and use that to get some of our food needs or protein needs that we need. So that is some of the ways that we can look at reducing the food. So that is the end of the lesson. So what we've looked at then is we've looked at how to evaluate how humans can successfully conserve ecological biodiversity. So we looked at some of the ways that we can do that, and contribute to global food production and appreciate the benefits that people obtain from ecosystems. So we've looked at those at that detail. So this is kind of ultimately what you need to take out of the lesson. Okay, so thank you for listening.